Hey everybody, Jen Hatmaker here, your host of the For the Love podcast. Buckle up today. Welcome to the show. Today, let me look. I officially kept my guest 16 minutes longer than our scheduled time, and I wanted to keep her another 4 hours. This conversation was so fascinating. We are in the throes of a series that has a lot of facets when it comes to who we are as women and how we were raised. And so I know in this particular community, a bunch of us spent a lot of formative years in a culture, spiritual culture, a religious culture that was largely patriarchal. And despite slow and steady progress in women's rights over the last 100 years, it's really only been maybe in the last 20 years that some of the most seismic shifts have occurred in this particular space. And so obviously we know that the patriarchy is still firmly in place, but there is this fascinating and inspiring tidal wave growing of women who have questioned it, who have pushed back against it, who have left it, litigated against it, exposed it, literally, in the case of our guest today, escaped it, which makes for a better world for the next generation and even a better one for the one after that. So in celebrating the rise of the matriarchy, as we've been calling it, we are looking at how patriarchal rule, particularly when combined with religious, not just fervor, but supposed mandate from heaven, created women who were groomed to believe that their only worth was how they could serve men and have babies. Our guest this week has a very personal story to tell about how she essentially escaped that culture. And her story represents a pretty extreme point on the patriarchal spectrum. But at the end of the day, anytime a woman feels like she doesn't have agency over her own life, her own body, her own authority, her own desires, no matter how subtle, there's damage to her growth and development. And a lot of us in this world are still digging out of some of that early messaging, particularly around purity culture. I mean, that has created so much sexual and emotional trauma for so many, not just women and girls, of course, but also for boys. And it's the work of a lifetime, actually, to dismantle what a lot of those messages built inside of us during our formative years. So, this conversation is going to get you. We've got Cait West today. She's a writer, she's an editor, she's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her work has been published in all kinds of places. She is an advocate and a survivor of the Christian patriarchy movement, literally what it's called. She serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, which is a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse. And so she was absolutely raised in the Christian patriarchy movement. Cait West was homeschooled K through 12. She could only wear clothes her father deemed modest. In fact, she was 5 years old, and she tells this story. The first time she was told her swimsuit was too revealing, she was in kindergarten. There would obviously be no college in her future, no career. She was to be a stay-at-home daughter, and she would move out only when her father allowed her to become a wife, which also meant picking her husband. And of course, only courting, no dating, no physical exploration, of course, always with a chaperone. She talks about it. She was trained to serve men, and her life would literally never be her own until she did escape. And she's going to tell us all about it today. So if you've ever grown up with any sense of an innate male authority over your life, over your agency, over your autonomy, and certainly over your future, particularly if it was baked into a religious space, this conversation is going to fascinate you today. It's going to feel resonant, and ultimately, it's going to feel so hopeful. So I couldn't get enough today, guys. Um, please enjoy this fascinating conversation with the very courageous Cait West. Thanks for being here. I'm
Thanks for having
really
me.
looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. Um, and I wanted to share that I heard you speak maybe 8 years ago. And for me, it was a really impactful moment because you were talking about speaking up about injustice, and that really helped trigger me to tell my story. So thank you. This feels like a full circle moment.
That's amazing. 8 year ago, me was different and just emerging. I was emerging in a certain way 8 years ago. And so I don't know what I said that day, but I remember what I was going through in 2016, and it was a lot. So, what a year to meet you. I wonder if you wouldn't mind, right before we sort of really drill in here. And by the way, thank you for sending me your book. I am, I got that last week, and we're going to talk about that at length today. But before we do, I wonder if you could just way up here, like just tell my listening community this is who I am, and this is where I am, and these are sort of the elements of my life at this point. And then we'll really get a little bit more into your story.
Sure. Um, my name's Cait West. I am a writer and an editor. So my day job is editing books, and I've been writing on the side. That's what I studied in college. Um, so my new book is called Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy, and it's my expression of my life thus far and what I've been through, and it just feels like this very creative endeavor to put out in the world. But I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not native, so the Midwest is starting to grow on me a little bit. And I also volunteer with a nonprofit called Tears of Eden. We serve survivors of spiritual abuse, and that's really meaningful time in my life when I get to pass on the help I've received and keep that chain going and hopefully help with the healing of so many.
Yes. So thank you. So you just did a little light touchdown of the big points of the story, of the plot line. Let's go back to give everyone some context on why you now serve within an organization that works with victims of spiritual abuse and what you know about that. So I'd like to hear you talk about the environment you grew up in, where I don't know, you know what? I'm not going to steal your thunder. You can tell us. Um, this is a severe end of a spectrum that a lot of my listening community understands. Maybe not to that furthest degree, but all along, as you know, it is a continuum. And so I believe that your story is about to be really resonant in one way or another for a lot of my listeners. So can you talk a little bit about that childhood environment?
Sure. And in the spectrum you're talking about, I feel like I've lived all aspects of that because when I was born, I was baptized into a conservative Presbyterian church, which is very common in the US. And so I would consider that pretty typical evangelical. But the older I got, the more my family became involved in something called the Christian patriarchy movement. And that's the term that we would have used. Um, or it's also known as biblical patriarchy. And the idea is that men are leaders of all realms of society. So the church, the family, the government, and women are supposed to submit and follow. They don't really have any choices within this community. And for me, growing up as a girl, I was told, I was homeschooled, so I was isolated. And then the older I got, the more extreme our beliefs became. And I was told I would never go on dates. I would never go to college. I would never have a real job. And my whole calling was to become a wife and a mother and have as many children as possible. So I I didn't have any choices in that. I didn't know that I could have a voice or have any say over my future. So that's just the environment that I grew up in. And I didn't get out until I was 25 because those lies were so strongly bound around me.
Mhm. I'd love to hear a little about your mom, because as mentioned, you started in what might have been a little bit more of a conventional evangelical space and then moved to one that was more extreme, in which your mom would have been expected at that point to also give up her autonomy and independence. And so I don't know if it's too personal to talk about her perception of this shift and what that looked like in her life, because that had been the primary female figure in yours as well.
Mhm. Growing up, I had heard stories of how my mom used to have a job. She went to college at one point. She had her own dreams, but I was told that because we learned this supposedly truth of what God wanted from our family, that's why she gave up all of that and became a stay-at-home mom. And so she homeschooled me from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And I didn't understand the context of why she behaved that way and how she was very submissive. And now I think I have a little more complex understanding of that. I think she didn't have a lot of choices. My father's very authoritarian, very controlling. And I think she put herself in that position thinking that it would protect us from more harm if she followed the rules and brought us up in the way that we could conform. So I don't think of her as having malicious intent in that. I do see like there's the enabling of what happened, but again, she didn't have a lot of choices in that in our
Hmm.
family.
It is pretty well documented that that movement and others like it, that is one version of a lot of versions that we have inside religious patriarchy, appeals particularly to men with an authoritarian bent, who would like to have carte blanche control of the certainly the women in their lives, but really their lives, period, and culture and society. Um, not that as not that more gentle men cannot be sucked into that fray. Of course, they can and have been, but I I'm curious about your dad. If you're willing to talk about both how he adapted to this religious mandate, if you will. And also, I'd like to hear you talk about what were some of the key front doors that opened to pull you out of just a Presbyterian environment into one that was full religious patriarchy. Like, was it a teacher? Was it a curriculum? Was it, how did this happen?
Right.
Two big questions. Take whichever one you
Yeah.
want first.
I'll start with my dad. He's he has a very charismatic personality. He can step into a room and be the life of the party. And I think a lot of people who are like him look that way from the outside, but on the inside in our family, he was very controlling. There's always lots of rules to follow, and if you disobeyed, there was harsh punishment. Um, he didn't like anyone going against what he said. And so I think he was drawn to this belief system because it gave him validation for wanting to control us. It gave him, it said, this is God's blessing if you control us. So I think that he was drawn to it. And I know different men come to this differently, but that's how I see my father coming to it. And I can see, if I go back in my childhood, I can see the little steps as we became more and more radicalized. And I remember there's just one family I talk about in the book where the dad and my dad were really good friends, and they would always have these conversations. And from what I remember, he was the one who introduced our family to this magazine called Patriarch magazine. It's literally the name of it. And the whole idea was to indoctrinate and spread these teachings. It was a very grassroots type of newsletter. So that's one of the first things that I remember happening that brought us more along that spectrum to the extreme side. And with homeschooling, I think we were in an environment where we were I was very isolated. And so my dad brought in all these teachings through audio cassettes and sermons, and they were from patriarchal leaders. And so I didn't have a lot of outside information, but we heard teaching from people like Doug Wilson, who is still a leader in the patriarchy movement and very powerful. So this is not something that's gone away or that just happened in my childhood. It's just been going on for a few decades now. So those kinds of leaders were teaching these things, and it was it was the environment I swam in. Like it was just every time we were in the car, we listened to it. Every sermon we went to at church, we found a patriarchal church um, where the pastor was very much like this. So it was just everything that I was living in.
Hmm. Um, Parsing it out a little bit more, can you talk about there's so many elements growing up like this, but can you talk about what you were taught, what you were allowed, the limitations around your body? Um, you had virtually no autonomy around your body. Obviously, purity culture factored heavily into your trauma here. And this is a through line for a lot of people in this community to varying degrees, but we all know. We all know exactly what that was. And so um, I'd like to hear you talk about what you were told um, in the category of your health, your sexual possibility, and your future.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot I could say about that. I never received any sex education. So it was very much like abstinence and zero information about what even sex was. Um, the idea was I would learn on my wedding night what sex was, which is a terrible, terrible strategy. Terrible, yeah. And so with purity culture, you're expected to not have any kind of physical encounter with another person. And so you have no experience. And I was just hoping that whoever I got married to would be nice, and I was hoping that we could fall in love because even that wasn't a given. The idea was that I would marry somebody who agreed with my dad. And that was the main goal was marrying a patriarchal man. But my some of my earliest memories, like I can't remember a time when I felt at home in my body. And I think because these teachings happened so early on, one of the first scenes I write about in my book is one of my earliest memories, which is I was wearing a two-piece bathing suit. I was 5 years old, and I don't remember where it came from. I think it was like a hand-me-down or something like that. I was just a little kid and wanted to go swimming. And then my dad got upset and he told my mother to tell me to go change. So he directed her to tell me to do that, which is an interesting dynamic. But all I remember feeling was I did something bad, something about my body is wrong to have it seen. I had no idea, like I'm a five, I'm not, there's no idea about sexuality that
You're
in
in
my,
kindergarten.
yeah.
Yes.
So I just remember all this shame and this feeling of something's wrong with me. And I carried that throughout my childhood. And it was enforced by these ideas that my body's not my own. My heart is deceitful. Um, when I get married, I need to be available 24/7 for my husband. So, so things like marital rape happen a lot in these communities because women are trained from childhood not to have any agency or to understand what sexual assault even is. Um, so it's just devastating to recognize that in my mid 20s, like, oh, this is what happened to me. And even now, I'm struggling with coming back to my body. And I feel like the past few years, I've been more embodied and feeling more at home with myself. But it has definitely been a journey because I don't really have a baseline to
Of
go
course,
back to.
you have no precedence here. Nothing, there's no cork board to stick any of this to. You're making it up from scratch. You have said that this sort of totalitarian control of your life and your body at some point begin to manifest as anxiety and depression. I'd like to hear you talk about your earliest sense of those levels of despair and this forfeiture of whatever independence any normal person would ever want to have. How did that begin to feel? How did you make sense of your feelings? And how early did you begin to sort of start making the connection? This is why
Yeah,
I feel this way.
yeah. I think for me, I around puberty, around when I was 11, a lot of really big things happened in my life. My sister almost eloped with someone that my father didn't approve
Whoa.
of.
Whoa. How old was
My
she, by the way, at the time?
um I think she must have been 21, maybe.
Okay.
Um
Okay. I'm going to put a pin in that. I
yeah.
want to talk about the siblings in a second.
Okay.
Keep going.
And yeah, my older brother left at the age of 17 to join the army around the same time. And then 9/11 happened. And also, we had this big forest fire that near my house in Colorado, and we were evacuated for 2 weeks. And so, all of these things were happening around the same time where I was, coming into adolescence, where you're normally supposed to develop a sense of independence, but I was coming into it with all this fear, of I was told like 9/11 and forest fires were because we are sinful people, and my siblings were leaving or trying to leave, and they were becoming excluded from the family and cut off from the family. And so all of this fear I held inside. Um, and so I think that's what caused my anxiety as a teenager. But at the time, I thought it was because I wasn't a good Christian. I thought it was because I had doubts or I had questions and I couldn't make sense of some of the things I was being told. So I assumed it was me. I had a lot of self-loathing because I was taught to be that way. And I just thought it was my fault that I was anxious and depressed. And it wasn't until a decade later that I realized there's something wrong that's happening here. Um, and it happened after my own courtship. I had a courtship that failed and this big heartbreak. And I felt a lot at the time. And I was just like, this, it can't be wrong to feel these things. I was being told I had to repent of my emotions. And I was like, that can't be true. So that, that's a lot, like a decade worth of trauma and trying to figure things out. But I didn't realize that it wasn't my fault because I'd been told I was evil.
Of
And
course,
so,
inherently so.
yeah, so
Mhm.
I didn't get it that I was having mental health problems until much
Yeah.
later.
Really quickly before we move forward in your story, I'd like to hear about your siblings, and I was curious about how many of you there are, where you fall in the lineup, and did anybody else defect before you as probably an outrageous move of independence? And it sounds like at least there was an attempt. I don't know how far that went. Can you just, I know that's their stories and they have their own versions of everything here, but I'd like to hear what you were looking at inside the family in terms of sibs.
Yeah. So I have two older siblings, an older sister, an older brother, and then one younger brother. And my sister's 9 years older than me. So I felt like I was learning a lot from how my father treated her, that I became like really good at following the rules because I could see the moments where she was resisting this oppression and she would get in trouble. So when she tried to elope, she was working for a bakery and um, she met somebody there, and I think it must have felt like it was the only way to get out or the only way to find happiness and have a choice. But when my parents found out the day of, they they made me feel at least like she was dead to us. We were never going to talk to her again. And there was a few hours where I remember because I wrote about this in my journal because I was like grieving that loss of my sister, um, that she's never going to come home. And I think something must have happened in those few hours where she changed her mind. And maybe it was because she didn't want to lose her family. That's huge. And so she came home. My dad made her quit her job and she became even more isolated and eventually got married through a courtship. And she has her own story about that. And years later, she has 5 kids. She got divorced. She's a single mom and she's doing amazing. But she has her own journey of figuring her way out. Yeah. So I don't want to share too much, but I'm just really proud of her and what she's been able to do. And my older brother, he never felt like he was part of the Christian faith. So when he was 17, he was like, yeah, he was like, I'm out. So that's why he joined the army. And we lost contact for a few years and eventually reconciled. And yeah, he didn't see a lot of the patriarchal stuff because he left so early. He didn't see how I grew up with this. So, and as a man, he wouldn't have been impacted the same way. Yeah, yeah. But seeing him like leave and I was being told he's a prodigal son, he lost. And so both of these experiences taught me never break the rules, never leave. You're going to get cut off from your whole world. Um, so that's what I was going through. And my younger brother, he's 3 years younger than me. Um, and he has, each of my siblings has an incredible story of how we got out because we've all gotten out of this system. So that's good news. Um, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, but my younger brother's gay, and when he came out to me, I didn't know, I had no resources to know how to handle it or, because you're taught horrible things about people who were in the LGBT community. So, um, it really opened my eyes because I love my brother and yeah, I want him to be happy. And he shared with me that what we were being taught made him feel like he could never be in a loving relationship with another person. And that broke my heart. That's what I was experiencing because our feelings didn't matter. So, he left right around the same time I did. And a little bit, I think a few months after. And so I felt like when I left, I was shattering the family because we hadn't really talked openly about all of this. So it felt like I was devastating our entire community. But over time, all my siblings and I have all talked through it and we've been able to hang out again and heal those relationships which were
Mm,
broken. So
I'm
I'm really
sure.
grateful for that.
Let's talk about that leaving process. Can you tell us more about, obviously, this was building like as a pressure cooker inside your body, inside your mind, inside your psyche, and leaving, exerting control over your own story is the worst thing you could do inside an environment like that. That is, you were not allowed. The end. I mean, this would have to have been a complete breach of every authority figure, right? Who God had placed over your life. That's that system. And 21 is not old. That is, I mean, obviously you're a young adult, but we now know that 21 is young. And so, or I guess you were 25, but 21 is you are beginning to sort of like connect your pieces. So, how did you do it? And how scared were you? And who helped you, if anybody did? And what did that early leaving process look like and feel like for you? Because you were supposed to be a stay-at-home daughter, right? Until, well, and you almost were, right? You had a failed courtship. And for people who don't know what courtship is, it's your dad pretty much chooses a person for you, and you did you always have to have a chaperone?
Yes, always
Yes.
chaperoned.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you don't really, did you get to hold hands or no?
No, no, no.
No, 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 no touching, no nothing,
No
no,
feelings.
none, no feelings. It's really just, this is your person I've chosen. This third person will be here with you anytime you spend together, and then you'll get married and work
Yeah.
it out. Yeah. Okay.
Also,
Okay.
also in my family, we did a weekly meeting with my dad, and he would ask us really embarrassing questions like, have you ever looked at pornography and stuff? So we had to like answer those to my dad in this courtship process. So
Oh God.
that was
And how
not
old were you, by
fun.
the way, when you were in this relationship?
This first courtship I started, I was 20 and I was
Okay.
21 when my dad ended it.
Oh, your dad ended it. Oh God. Okay. Can we just talk about that for 1 second before we get forward? That feels like too big of a piece to leave on the table.
Yeah, I mean, you're trained to become a wife, right? And so I had never really felt like super excited about that, but it was just like this is what I'm gonna do. My secretly I wanted to fall in love and have a romantic relationship. And so when this man approached my dad and asked to have a courtship with me, I was really excited. He was really nice. He was funny. He has a good storytelling. And we had a long courtship because my father kept finding issues with him that he needed him to correct or find a different job, or he became sort of controlling of him too. And I mean, I think it's very natural to fall in love with someone that you think you're going to get married to, or just like imagining what it would be like. And I think I fell in love with an idea of this person because I didn't really know him very well. So when my father ended it because he didn't think that he was following his rules to the T, I was brokenhearted. And then I couldn't handle it. And at the same time, my father is telling me to repent because I have emotions for him, which is essentially saying I deserve to go to hell because I love somebody. And that's that pivotal moment when I was thinking that that's not true. Like I just knew deep inside that's not true. And that's a scary thing to realize, like your father is lying to you about something. It's terrifying because my whole life was staked on this. I I didn't have anything else. Um, so so yeah, that was a really difficult feeling, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm never going to let this happen to me again. And obviously, I didn't leave for 4 more years, but I was really committed to like finding my way out at that point.
You were. Okay. So let's fast forward. Obviously, you spent 21 to 25, at least internally processing. Did you have any allies in your life who were safe people to talk to or to process information with? No.
There were a couple instances where I felt like I could talk a little bit. So, my older brother, we had reconnected, and I thought maybe I can move in with him, because he would understand. So he offered for me to stay with him. That was one idea. And he had been married at that point. And his wife, I remember her asking me, like, are you okay? Like, is this what you want? And just the idea of somebody asking me what I wanted, nobody had ever asked me that. And I was like, oh, I think I said probably whatever script I had been given, like, of course I want this, like, this is what I'm supposed to do. But just that question made me think about it and gave me the opportunity to realize, oh, I have agency in my life. I do have choices. So that those kind of small things. And then I had a friend who lived in Michigan actually, and I saw on Facebook that she got married, but her parents weren't at the wedding. So I contacted her and I was like, what's going on? And she told me how her parents had disapproved of her relationship and how she got married anyways and was making choices for herself. So that was like the one person I knew who had been through something similar and had gotten out. So that was like my one light at the end of the
Yeah.
tunnel. Like it is possible.
Hmm. So you're ruminating on it. You're collecting very few, but a couple of stories of possibility. Um, what happens at 25?
Yeah. I had this idea of like this vague plan of moving out somehow and like I would probably be broke. And because people who are stay-at-home daughters, we aren't usually have any finances, or in many cases, our parents control our bank accounts. So in my case, I had this loophole where I was allowed to teach piano lessons to other homeschooled kids, and I was allowed to keep the money. So that was my probably the biggest resource I had to leave. Because we lived in Hawaii, it wasn't like I could just drive away, and it's very expensive to live there. And so I was saving some money because I was like, I need to get out and I need to save some of this money. And at the same time, I met somebody at church and we became best friends. And then we started to fall in love. And then we thought maybe we should have a courtship, and see how that goes. And my father said yes for 1 week. And then he changed his mind.
Hmm. You found
And
fault with him?
yeah, he was like, oh, he doesn't have $40,000 in the bank. Something really weird. Who has that? I don't
Right, right. Nobody
know.
has that, Dad.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
especially when you're a young adult. So, we decided, well, it wasn't really a decision, but we just had a secret relationship. And so I felt like I'm going to hang around a little bit longer because I felt this connection with somebody who was treating me like I mattered and like my opinions mattered. He asked me what I like to read. He was interested in my thoughts. Like that had never happened before. And so I'm going through all this mentally, like this figuring out that I don't belong here. At the same time, I'm falling in love. At the same time, I'm trying to save money. And then it all just collides. And, um, we get engaged against my father's blessing. He said he wouldn't give us his blessing. And that's when we moved to Michigan. And I used that piano money the only thing I brought with me were boxes of books and a suitcase of clothes. And I started over here in Michigan and we got married and we're still together. So it's a strange story. Really happy with how
Mhm.
it all turned out because it was scary for a while.
Oh my God, I have a million questions. I just have a million questions because you grew up literally isolated. You were religiously and spiritually isolated. You were geographically isolated. I mean, you're in Hawaii. There's just you're locked in every which way. So your exposure, I'm sure, to the rest of the world was limited and controlled. And so I just I am trying to think about you, 25, like forced to be as naive as you were. Literally, you didn't have a choice to have a wider perspective on the world, on people, on life. on sexuality, on anything really. Like, I'm trying to think about you landing in Michigan with your box of books and your piano money, like you were dropped on Mars, like with a boyfriend. Everything is outside of what your experience had been. What it, I'm guessing, certainly not going to lead the witness because you're going to tell your own truth here, but I am guessing it was bumpy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a
Can
little
you talk
bit.
about it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had to leave my parents, and that was the hardest part, was getting on that plane and saying goodbye and not knowing
Were
if
they
I'd ever see.
furious? What
My
were
mo
they?
my mother was supportive in the way that she
Oh,
could be, which I'm
okay.
really grateful for. Um, yeah, the way that she could be very quiet, but my father was very angry. But at the point when I was moving away, he had stopped talking to me mostly, and I was like shut down. Um, Up until that point, there was a lot of like verbal abuse and things happening that made the home really unsafe for me. So leaving felt this complicated situation of, I'm leaving something that's not safe for me. At the same time, I'm leaving my parents who are supposed to love me. And it felt like this huge break. It felt like, I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. It was just really devastating. And then I take this long plane trip to Michigan, and my fiance is on the other side. And we have this beautiful summer of planning a quick wedding and just going on dates, which I'd never done before. Um, and it was this beautiful experience of feeling alive and free and just like letting go of all this stress. But then reality kicked in, because you got to make money. Um, I have mental health issues I didn't realize. I had PTSD, um, which I didn't have language for at the time. So I was having panic attacks, nightmares. Um, and it was just really difficult because I was very confused. Like, I'm out of this situation, and all of a sudden my body's experiencing all the trauma after the fact. Because I was like in survival mode, and now I'm out, and it's all manifesting. So that was scary. And then I had to find a job, and I went on so many job interviews. I had to teach myself how to write a resume. I was at the library all the time. And I finally got a job at a little bakery and started going to community college. And that just opened up my whole life. I took an intro to psychology class where my teacher helped me understand why I was having nightmares. So I couldn't
Wow.
afford therapy, but I could do
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
And
Community
so,
college was therapy. Yep.
yeah, right. Because I was trying to survive, and I was able to get some scholarships and some grants to help me get to college. And yeah, it was very bumpy, but also so liberating to explore who I am and what I want to do, and how do I behave around other people, and I can create my own relationships and no one's telling me what to do anymore.
Mhm.
It was wild.
How did your fresh new young husband handle all this?
He's always been my steady companion because he experienced some of that verbal abuse from my dad, and he knew what it was like. And so when we left, he was just always there, like very grounding person. And when I would have anxiety attacks, he didn't understand what's going on either, but he would just sit with me until I could get through it, and come back to like regulate my nervous system. So he just was there with me through it. And that meant more than having someone try to fix it or tell me what to do. So we've been through a lot together. And now we have a lot more language for what happened. And we've both been to therapy. We've both worked through our issues, and really grateful for all of that.
Ooh. So You completely rebuilt your life. Well, you built a life is what you did. You didn't really rebuild it. You built it for the first time, um, with your own ideas and your own desires. And I wonder if we can fast forward a little bit. I really could keep you on this interview for 100 hours. I've got 1,000 like micro questions all along the way, but I really want to hear you talk about Tears of Eden and at what point you began to realize, oh, I have something to say here. Like, this is not just me. This, there are like silent, suffering people everywhere who've been through this. How did this come up in your life? And at what point did you feel ready to be on the other side of the equation?
That was a long process because I wanted
I'm
to
sure.
leave it all behind and start new and just never talk about it ever again. That's not how life works because we are who we are. And um, when I was, when I was studying in college, I studied writing and I wanted to do fiction writing, but we had to choose a second genre. So I picked creative nonfiction, which makes you write about yourself. And so I started writing a little bits and pieces of my experience and then witnessed my classmates and my professors like not understand what was happening. Like, this is how you grew up. This is really crazy. For me, it was normal. And I realized I had a story to tell. And then um, going to writing conferences and learning from other writers like you who was talking about speaking up for injustice, I decided to tell part of my story online. And I started doing that around 2018, 2019, and realized there's a lot more people who've been through this and they've just been silenced or afraid. People who if they say something, their family's going to cut them off. And that's what happened to me when in 2019, I had an interview and I started talking online about my experience, and my dad decided not to talk to me anymore. Um, so I've seen that happen. So I understand that fear. But once I lost that relationship, I felt liberated to tell my story because somebody has to. Somebody has to say something. This keeps happening. And the more I tell it, the more people I've met who, if they haven't experienced this extreme, they're somewhere on that spectrum of patriarchal oppression. And so I think it does resonate with a lot of women, especially those coming out of the evangelical church, which is how I met Tears of Eden. So the founder's name is Catherine Spearing, and she grew up very similar to how I grew up. And she started this organization for survivors of spiritual abuse because at the time, almost no one was using that phrase, spiritual abuse, or taking it seriously. And so she started this foundation. I heard about it through their podcast, and I went through their first support group, and I got to learn from a professional trauma therapist, and she helped walk us through how spiritual abuse was impacting us, and we got to talk in a safe community. It was all online, and it was this really transformative experience of being in a community again after being cut off from a community and realizing we could support each other. And
Was
so
it
shortly after,
primarily women?
yes,
Yeah,
primarily women and women led, and I think that's important to note is a lot of the people leading this movement of healing after spiritual abuse are women. Um, yeah. So shortly after that, I started volunteering with them, and now I'm on their editorial board where I get to help other survivors tell their stories on our website. And I personally think telling your story is one of the most important
yeah,
and powerful thing you can do to
that's
heal.
right. That's right. It's not neutral. That
Mhm.
is a healing step. Just putting your voice to use. What are some of the other tools that you put in the hands of women to hook into empowerment in any way? It's um, so deeply systemic to be that disempowered, which makes it not easy to climb your way out of it. These are not rungs of the ladder you've ever even had access to. And so, um, what are some of the other resources that you put around women, and probably some men too? Men are come up through spiritual abuse as well. Obviously, I think about your brother, your little brother, spiritual abused. And so, what does that look like? How do you uh, begin to help people have restored autonomy?
Because I am not a trauma expert, I'm a writer, a storyteller. That's where I see my best work being is helping people tell their stories and sharing my story so that they don't feel alone. And that supports like the bigger mission of Tears of Eden, where we do have trauma professionals who can walk people through this process of healing. And so through Tears of Eden, we've had a retreat. We'd had our first retreat last year. It was a beautiful experience of being embodied together. We did trauma-informed yoga, and we had experts come and speak to us. And it was just this wonderful experience of, it was like a retreat, but was more of, it wasn't quite a conference. It was more of a healing experience where you could just do whatever you wanted to do. You don't have to even show up to the talks. And so for me, I think the most important thing is showing people their options. And that's why I'm drawn to Tears of Eden because there is zero agenda for where you should end up. I think I see a lot of problem with spiritual abuse survivors and organizations trying to help them, but they're pushing them toward a certain belief system or a certain end result. And I don't think that is healthy. I think people should be given the agency to decide what they believe after experiencing this. And so I see my role as offering lots of options, showing lots of experiences, and then helping people realize they can make a choice.
That's good. That's so That's the most empowering thing. Because you're right, it's not a template. There is not a known quantifiable end game here for anyone who has survived spiritual abuse. And so I really appreciate that you don't mandate where the road is going. That feels powerful to me. I have two more questions. Well, I have a million. I really do. I have a million questions, but I have two more that I really want to hear you talk about, particularly around this idea of embodiment and an agency, because these are related and these are linked. We are shockingly in an unbelievable age of Roe v. Wade being reversed. And many states, yours, mine, have effectively rolled back the rights and the resources for women when it comes to their reproductive choices and their decisions about their own bodies. And reproductive health is health. It is health. And so this obviously did not happen in a vacuum. And men are not the only ones behind these decisions, although they are largely behind these decisions. I want to hear you talk about how I'm jumping ahead to solutions. I think you and I could discuss the injustice of this forever. I want to talk about how we appeal, not just to the men, the men in power, the white men in power, but the women who may believe that these laws are protecting them and protecting whatever. And how do we talk about authoritarian control over female bodies as not just dehumanizing and disempowering, but dangerous? People are going to die, and they are. Women will die, and they're already dying. So, Phil, I'd like to hear you discuss this.
Yeah. I remember when Roe v. Wade was overturned, and my whole body went into this sensation of shock. I just felt so sick, which I didn't expect. But it just reminded me so much of what it feels like to not have agency over my body and to be so controlled that I can't predict whether I'm going to get good health care if something happens. And so I think it's important to talk about what's really happening here, um, with reproductive rights, because what's happening with these laws is it's preventing health care for things like ectopic pregnancy and miscarriage treatment. And in the medical world, miscarriage treatment is the same process a lot of times as abortion, and they use the same words. And so when you're legislating, when politicians are legislating from zero experience in the medical field, they are harming women's choices to get healthcare because, an ectopic pregnancy can be fatal if untreated. Um, so women have died because of this move to legislate. And I think it's heartbreaking. I think that women are being lied to that it's protection because there's this push to use the word pro-life, but we keep seeing legislators making rules that are hurting people or and even if you have a baby, the laws are not protecting that baby. Like we just have a broken system, right? It's not pro-life, it's pro-birth. And so I think we need a bigger holistic view of what's really happening because the people at the top of this, they don't actually, in my opinion, care about women's bodies. I think they care about controlling them. And then the people who are following are afraid or they're being told lies to be afraid of what the future is. And so they're voting for them. So I think education and that's uncomfortable, right? Like I grew up very evangelical, so learning about abortion was very uncomfortable for me. Um, but it's completely changed my mind of what's actually happening in the real world. Um, and I'll just share my experience here in Michigan. So when Roe v. Wade was overturned, we have this, I think it was like 100-year-old ban that was going to go back into effect. And so people, especially women all over the state, rallied and created a proposal for reproductive rights. It was called Reproductive Freedom for All. And so I got to sign the petition to put it on the ballot, and we got it on the ballot. And then I joined an organization to help educate people about the proposal. And I tried cold calling, and I talk about this at the end of the book, how it was really difficult for me to speak with it's so personal to me. And I had this experience where someone who answered the phone and said, shame on you. And all that shame came back. And I was like, I don't know if I can keep calling and talking about this issue. And that's why I suggest to people to find the skills that they already have and use those to help promote education about this issue. Because not all of us are good at speaking, well, not all of us are good at phone calls. I'm better at writing, so I've tried to write about this. If you're in your community, there's small ways that you can take a part in helping turn this around. And that's what happened in Michigan. So now our state constitution protects reproductive rights. So that's huge. It's possible. And so I didn't do a lot, but I helped, and I think if we focus on it's an impossible problem, then we just get paralyzed. But we can focus on our little world and what we can do, and we don't have to fix everything, but we can do our best. And I think together we can turn it around.
Hmm. And it's been said, it's almost trite at this point, but we vote. It matters. It matters who's in charge. It matters who's legislating and who's at our state governments and certainly at our federal government too, but our local stuff that's where this is being redirected. And so women voting in their own best interest will change everything. One last question with two parts. I can't. Sorry. Can you talk about what, if anything, faith looks like to you now? What is that strata in your life today?
Sure. It's been a long process of,
Yeah.
you know, deconstructing these fundamentalist beliefs about me as a woman. And when I left, I still went to church for quite a while. And then I realized patriarchy was happening in that church, just in a very subtle way. They didn't use that word. I wasn't allowed to write. I wanted to write a resource for abuse survivors, but I had to have my husband's permission to do that.
Oh, oh God.
And
Okay.
so all these red flags started building up and building up, and I realized this is not a safe place for me anymore. I tried my best to like be a voice, but they weren't open to listening. And so I eventually left, and I haven't been back to church since. Um, and that's because once I stopped going, I felt like my body could relax and come back to some kind of regulation because I was constantly in this environment where I wasn't accepted for who I am. And from there, I've deconstructed my beliefs quite a bit. And so I don't follow a specific faith tradition anymore, but I do feel open to spirituality. And a lot of the people I write to they still hold on to Christian faith. So I want to hold all of that. And I think faith can be a really beautiful thing. Um, and for me, I've really loved learning from indigenous writers like Caitlin Curtis and Randy Woodley, and helped me see there's this other broader view of spirituality that I feel more at home with than going and sitting in a pew um, and doing religion that way. So that's currently where I am. I don't feel like I need to be at a certain spot, and I don't feel like I'm ever gonna reach an end result. I think that's just
Sure.
part of life.
Yeah. How old are you now?
I'm 36.
Yeah. It'll just keep rolling out. Just keep evolving, keep unfolding, and in my case, keep expanding. Yeah, way less things I'm sure about, but way broader things I'm curious about, which is a wonderful evolution. Last, truly, you made the decision to use your maternal grandmother's name as your writing pseudonym. And Cait West is your writing pseudonym. Can you share with us like where that decision came from?
Sure. I think any writer who's trying to figure out your voice and what you're trying to say has that question like, do I use my real name? Do I use a pseudonym? And I found a balance. So I use my real first name. So Kate's my real first name. And then West is my grandmother's, what we call the maiden name. And for me, it's always resonated with me, my mother's heritage, because they're Southerners. They grew up in poverty, but the women in my family have always been the leaders and the strong people of faith. And so to me, it's kind of like a calling back to that heritage and recognizing it and trying to hold on to some kind of legacy after losing so much of my life. And at the same time, recognizing it's still my grandmother's father's last name, right? So there is this impossible task of connecting with a matrilineal line in the current US. And so I'm okay with that tension. I think it's good to hold on to that tension and realize we live in a patriarchal society and we're navigating that and we're trying to do our best to make changes. But for me, it's really meaningful to have that name and I struggled with, do I use my father's last name? Do I use my husband's last name? But this to me feels more like me.
Hmm, I like that. Okay, you've done it. Um, you've done it. You've written about it in Rift. Um, which we've barely just scratched the surface here. Truly, there's it's a layered story. And so can you just tell my listening community where to follow you, where to find you, where to find your book, where if they are feeling really drawn to Tears of Eden, where they can find more information about that, all of it.
Great. Yeah. My website, caitwest.com. I spell my first name Cait. That's where you can find, I have a resource page there, and that includes a link to Tears of Eden. It also includes my story, my links to my book, and events that are coming up. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of traveling this summer, and that's one of my favorite parts of writing this book is getting to talk to people. So I really hope I can do more of that, is connecting with people. I'm also on social media at Cait West Writes on most platforms. So you can find me there too.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for bringing your story to bear in our world, because to your earlier point, you could have not. You could have just moved right on and put it in the rearview mirror and acted like this was just something behind you, but instead you're using it to heal and to lend courage to other people who need it at this moment in their life. And so proud of you. And I'm so glad for you that you've built a beautiful life out of what you want and of who you are and where you want to go. And so it's so hopeful. It's ultimately hopeful. And this possibility exists for everyone. It really does. You got to make some hard choices to get there, obviously, which you've made. But what a encouragement, truly an inspiration to go, this is possible. And so I'm excited for whoever's listening today going, oh my God, maybe me too. So everybody, I will put all those links up for you so you can have it in one-stop shop. And I'm so happy to have met you. And I'm so glad that our paths crossed 8 years ago when I was also kind of clawing my way out of some of the system that I was deeply embedded in at the time. And it's just exciting to know that freedom and liberation and autonomy gets even more expansive the more you push into it. So
true.
So true. Thanks for being on today.
Thanks for having me.
As mentioned, Cait and I really barely scratched the surface, even though I kept her on way past time. I'm proud of her. I really am. I'm proud of her and grateful for all the primarily women, but also men that she is lending a raft to out in the middle of the ocean saying, climb on, there's another way. As mentioned, if you go over to jenhatmaker.com under the podcast tab, I'm going to have this episode should you like to reshare it. We are so grateful when you do that. I can't tell you how many people have told me everywhere I travel about particular podcast episodes that changed their trajectories. Podcasts matter. Sometimes just hearing a story in the safety of your AirPods is enough impetus to start something new, to dismantle something toxic. And I'll never get over that. This might be one of those. Also over there, I will have a roundup of all the links mentioned, where to follow Cait on socials, where to find her book, where to get connected to Tears of Eden, everything. So thank you for listening. This whole series is fire hot on the matriarchy, which we named tongue in cheek a little bit. And this sense of female power and agency is obviously near and dear to me. And I'm passionate about using this space to create freedom and liberation for women. All right. More to come. If you haven't already subscribed to the show, do so. You will never miss an episode. So wherever you listen to podcasts, just hit the subscribe button and it'll show up for you week after week. We are delighted to serve you and can't wait for more in this series. All right, you guys, see you next week.